Amrit Singh, welcome back to the Deep End.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to speak with you. We actually recorded around this time last year. We focused a lot on building in the healthcare space in India. We're going to touch on that, but something I'm curious about, you've been on the Deep End before back in, June 2022. I'd love for you to reintroduce the company that you're building, Loop, and then of course articulate what has happened over the past year in your space at a founding level and all those good things.
Yeah, sure. I think when we spoke last, we had just kind of raised the Series B. At that point in time, we had just kind of crossed around 100,000 members insured in our healthcare plan. And I think since then we've had a really good year. We've grown about 6x, so we've just kind of crossed near 600,000 lives insured in India, all in India. And I can kind of talk through kind of what, just as a reminder to folks, what we do at Loop and why we do it. So we help companies in India get set up with health insurance plans for their employees. And we bundle those health insurance plans with really high quality primary care services with a focus on kind of identifying who in that population really needs help, whether it's the employees or it's the dependents they have covered. Many people have their parents covered on these plans. We identify who needs the most help, who's dealing with a chronic condition, who has maybe a recurring illness, who's claimed at a hospital last year, and we do our best to try to help these people, giving them dedicated healthcare support and really good preventive care. The reason to do this, though, is sort of interesting, right? Because the Indian healthcare system is so different than the U.S. I think most folks in the U.S. who are listening to this maybe kind of assume when you get a health insurance plan, you can use that for pretty much anything. You can go to see a primary care doctor, you can go do a specialist visit, you get a lab test done, you order medicines, everything happens through insurance. But in India, the insurance plans are just catastrophic care plans. So when you buy a health insurance plan, you only really get to use it when you have a critical illness, when you go to the hospital and you stay overnight and you have a major procedure. Everything else is out of pocket, right? So you have to, spend for your own doctor consults. You have to, if you go see let's say a cardiologist or endocrinologist for your circulatory issue, you end up having to pay out of pocket for that. Diagnostics, labs, everything is out of pocket. So for a lot of folks, there is this kind of financial friction to accessing healthcare. And what we're trying to do is remove that friction by bundling in really high quality primary care, give access to specialists for free to our member base, so to reduce that friction and make healthcare more accessible. And in the long term, what we can do with that is by kind of giving people access early, prevent critical issues or illnesses that may come up from, let's say, ignoring your chronic condition for too long, which then maybe leads to a really expensive hospital visit that isn't fun for you or your family members. So our question is, that we're trying to solve is how can we bring really high quality preventive care into a space where really that hasn't been covered under existing insurance plans in India and give people this thing for the first time.
I love that summary you just gave of the problem and the question you're solving. Walk us through the idea maze of how you actually got to where you are now then.
Sure, yeah. So actually it starts with my co-founder Mayank, who I met actually at the University of Illinois. We were studying there together. I'm born and raised in Chicago, but my family's from India, and so I'd visited many times growing up. Mayank is from India, and he actually moved to the U.S. when he was 18 for school. So we ended up kind of spending a bunch of time together in college, working on different startup ideas. And in our senior year, he actually ended up getting a call from back home. His father had a heart attack, and so he had to go home to take care of his dad and be there to support his family. And what he learned in the months following that incident is that his father had a stent placed in his heart that was actually unnecessary. And so he realized, and this was sort of eye-opening for both of us as I was hearing about his experience, that really there are a lot of different incentives at play in the healthcare system. And a lot of the healthcare system is highly commercialized. People in India in particular sometimes get overprescribed medicines they don't need, procedures they don't need. And so that's caused this large lack of trust in the healthcare system at large. So in fact, you can see, if you look at India, a lot of folks actually prefer to use Ayurvedic practitioners, people who sort of practice Eastern methodologies of medicine, because they feel that those are lower risk. Even if they're not getting necessarily the right allopathic treatment, they don't have that trust in the healthcare system to believe in maybe what the doctor or the specialist is telling them. And so they kind of lean towards natural treatments, which maybe have lower downside. And so you have this sort of really interesting phenomenon in India where you have, a lot of folks who are kind of walking into a healthcare system. They're maybe not as educated, they're not as literate. Many of them don't have insurance products to cover the really expensive procedures. And so already they're kind of at odds with the healthcare system. And then you have this layer of distrust on top of that. So we thought, there's a really fascinating thing to build here by giving people access to really high quality second opinions. That was kind of originally what we had set out to build. And as we sort of meandered through the idea maze, we realized that maybe the bigger opportunity, rather than just second opinions, is how do we create an entire healthcare system from scratch, owning both the health insurance piece, taking risk on people, but then also delivering really high quality preventive and primary care to keep them healthy, and sort of aligning all the incentives for the first time in the Indian healthcare system, which doesn't yet exist. And I think in the US, we talk a lot about value-based care, integrated care plans. It's quite common, even the insurance companies have had these HMO and PPO concepts for a long time, where they're really trying to direct the care for a patient and have some control over that care journey. But in India, you have the health insurers and the healthcare system at odds. The health insurer doesn't really have any say in the care journey for a patient, and a lot of folks go through the healthcare system and end up kind of getting charged with things that they shouldn't be getting charged for, doing unnecessary procedures, like I said. And so our question was, how could we create a healthcare system that aligns those incentives and brings the payers and the care providers on the same side of the cost equation, working on behalf of the patient always. And so slowly, as we kind of made our way through different iterations of this, we realized the scale of the opportunity. And since then, we've been focused on getting our health insurance product in the hands of as many people as possible, and then trying to activate those folks into our healthcare system, which is our primary care services, teleconsults, and now offline clinics where Loop members can actually walk in and get a free consult at their local Loop clinic. So that's kind of how we found our way here.
That's so fascinating, especially because having interviewed a lot of founders in the health, longevity, healthcare space, oftentimes the opportunities they've identified are, here's this like specific niche within the American healthcare system. We're going to start with that niche, and then we're going to kind of expand up from there. And maybe like this part of like Medicare will like pay for it. And then that's our best case scenario. You're describing building an entire system from scratch. Can you really compare and contrast what it's like to build within those two different options of approach?
Yeah, sure. I think to some extent, though, the U.S. healthcare system has developed to a point where it can afford, founders can afford to build businesses very condition specific. A founder can focus on a rare disease and build a fairly valuable business because there's a lot of money in healthcare in the U.S. We know, I think the often cited stat is that 18% or 20% of US GDP goes into health insurance. And even United Health, for example, I think manages more than $2 trillion in premiums, right? So, you have $1 cent in every dollar in the US health system going through United Health at some point, which is, massively large. Right, you don't have that same thing in India. The health insurance market is still $11 billion in total. So it's a much smaller market. And so I think there's less of an opportunity to build valuable businesses just focused on one chronic condition. In fact, I think it makes sense for founders building right now in India, if they look at the economics of it all, that they almost have to build for multiple segments of the population, cover multiple disease categories in order to build a valuable business. So that's sort of the economic caveat here, which is it's maybe it's just a little bit more of a developed system in the U.S. There's more money in the system, and so it offers an ability to create a very different kind of company. So that's one frame. The second thing that's sort of interesting is we talk about India like it's one country, but it's more like an entire continent. It's called the subcontinent, right?
Yeah, I was going to say.
But it's very hard to sort of kind of look at India and say any one model could work also. You have a state like Gujarat, for example, which is kind of like a state of an average size in India. Most folks maybe don't know Gujarat as a state, but just to kind of compare this, like Spain has about 40, 50 million people, a population of 40 or 50 million. Gujarat as a state, which I think a lot of folks probably haven't heard of, has 70 million people just in that state. And there are, more than 20 states in India. And so it's kind of like you're looking at Europe, right? And you're trying to say, what healthcare system or what business models might work in Europe? Well, every state is different. They have their own cultural differences, their socioeconomic differences, the way that the governments are run, the investments in infrastructure, the investments in public hospitals are different. So I think to say, as we were kind of making our way through the idea maze too, we had to really recognize that India is a vast country with a lot of different people, and there isn't going to be, one healthcare system that works for everyone. And so we were very careful to sort of carve out which markets we wanted to go after and which customer segments we wanted to go after in order to make the thing we're trying to build work.
And that's why when you're articulating the idea, you're starting with like the employers and the bundles, like that was a good initial market to build in then, correct?
That's right. Yeah. So just to kind of think about India in a couple ways, one way to stratify India is through its economic classes. And you have sort of the bottom half of India going through this transition out of, a state where NCDs, where viral issues are the big disease and the problem, to a place where NCDs, non-communicable diseases, become the problem. So as you go from kind of rural areas to metros, the type of healthcare problems people experience are very different. Just as an example, every year in India, 200,000 people still die from tuberculosis, for which we've had a cure for 60 or 70 years, I think even longer than that. Many, many years now we've had a cure for tuberculosis, but it's very hard to deliver that kind of care to every corner of the country. And so folks in rural areas often face viral issues, parasitic issues, and so there's very different kinds of healthcare problems there. They don't have insurance plans, and they rely heavily on government-run hospitals. Whereas in the metros, I think it looks a lot more like, healthcare in the US does. Most people get insurance through their employers. They tend to prefer private hospitals. They maybe have a preferred doctor or GP they can go to, and they're willing to spend for those consults. And we said, if we look at this population in a metro where people are already getting a health insurance plan, right, that catastrophic insurance plan, what can we do to sort of make these plans better, more useful, and actually attack the chronic conditions that are much more prevalent in the metros, right? So they face a lot less of the sort of viral issues and much more of the same chronic conditions we face in the US with diabetes, CVD, other circulatory issues, kidney problems, and then, in the long run, cognitive issues as well for parents. And so we thought, let's start here with a group of people we know that already has this financial instrument called health insurance, and let's try to make that product as useful as possible, not just kind of limited to the one time every 3 or 4 years you may go to the hospital for a critical illness, but something that you can use, anytime you feel sick, anytime your kid feels sick, you can just pick up the phone, call Loop, and get healthcare help immediately.
Something I'm curious about, what has this deep dive at a literal level you've made into the Indian healthcare system, what has that taught you about the American healthcare system and like what works, like what doesn't work, opportunities you may just notice? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there are some really interesting nuances between India and the US in that, like I said, I think the US healthcare system is far more developed in that there's a lot more money in the system. And there's been a lot more medical inflation for many more years. And so healthcare is far more expensive in the U.S. So insurance is a requirement in the U.S. If you don't have it and something goes wrong, you're far more likely to face a personal bankruptcy, candidly. And just kind of as an example, an employer in the U.S. will spend about 8 to 10% of an employee's salary towards their health insurance plan. Whereas in India, an employer would spend 1.5% of an employee's annual salary towards the health insurance plan. So the costs haven't necessarily inflated to the same degree yet. And from a regulatory standpoint, healthcare in the U.S. is far more regulated. So you have laws like HIPAA that kind of require healthcare providers to treat patient data a certain way. Whereas in India, you don't really have that. You have sort of general IT and privacy laws around data, and that also applies to healthcare data, but it isn't treated uniquely. And so, the interesting thing we see is that enables, let's say, doctors to do consults over a WhatsApp video call, or to issue a prescription over a WhatsApp. Many services I've seen in India where there is a local clinic set up and they're doing virtual consults over Google Meet or Zoom. And so there is actually less kind of restriction in that sense. There's also a little bit more of a free market element, which also creates some of these bad behaviors we talked about. A lot of times it's common for a doctor to get a referral fee for sending a patient to a hospital, right? So if you come into my clinic in Mumbai and I send you to a hospital and you end up getting a procedure, right? In the case of Mayank's dad, for example, he got a stent sort of unnecessarily placed in his heart. It's possible that the GP that referred that patient to the hospital gets 10 or 15% of the value of that procedure back. And so there are these sort of free market elements which enable two things. One, there's this sort of these negative incentives that come into play, which makes patients have to be far more careful when they're making healthcare decisions, and have to really trust the care provider they're working with. But on the other side of things, it also enables a lot more speed in terms of getting care quickly, getting care inexpensively, being able to try and experiment with new products and services in healthcare. I've seen a lot of founders recently in India launch products around chronic care, right? But they don't necessarily need specific regulatory approval to do that. They don't have to navigate this maze of CPT codes with insurance companies trying to figure out what they can bill for. They can just go direct to consumer with a product, test that product and service, and if the customer likes it, they'll pay for it directly out of pocket, because there is that, that habit of paying out of pocket for your healthcare in India that doesn't happen in the US. So I think there are kind of pros and cons to the differences on the regulatory side that make India a really interesting place to innovate and actually to get to scale much faster than you could in the US for a healthcare product.
Fascinating. Something I'm curious about, how read into or engaged with India were you before you started the company? Just in the sense that, you're describing how complicated this market is. This seems to be at the apex of tough founder jobs, as in jumping into a literal subcontinent and trying to build in a very difficult category. So how much of this is you knowing stuff beforehand versus learning on the job?
I think, candidly, and I think most founders would say this, even in the US, you learn mostly on the job, and you end up, certainly I think as I moved to a new country, there were a lot of cultural differences I had to understand, nuances around how healthcare worked and how, what even a doctor means to a person in India, and how they treat their doctors. It's very different than I think how we treat doctors in the US. And so, I think there were a lot of these sort of cultural nuances I had to pick up on, but as far as product building and operating and kind of selling and growing our team out, I think a lot of that has been on the job, but I think founders in the US would say the same thing, that most of the learning they do is on the job. There are a few things I had heard about which were really interesting to me though before I had moved. I had heard of Narayana hospitals and Arvind eye hospitals, which had actually have figured out a way to scale surgeries. So they figured out a way, Arvind, for example, does 300,000 eye-related surgeries every single year. One hospital chain doing 300,000 eye-related surgeries. A lot of that is cataract surgeries or LASIK surgeries, but that's 10 times the volume of the largest hospitals in the US. And so because of the scale of the population, these healthcare players have emerged in India where they're able to sort of almost assembly line the procedures. They're able to have multiple patients on multiple operating tables simultaneously getting their cataract surgeries done. And so because of the scale, I think India has had to kind of develop their health system with that volume in mind. And then also the unique thing in India is that because it's generally low trust, right? I think I mentioned, people don't necessarily inherently walk into a doctor's office saying, you tell me what's best and I'll follow suit. They tend to be a little bit more skeptical. Naturally, that means that people end up having trust in kind of two things. One is the big brands that everyone is familiar with, and then the other is kind of your word of mouth relationships with family and friends who've had a good healthcare experience. And so they end up kind of relying on these two things as signals to make decisions in their healthcare journey. And so naturally, you actually end up having a lot more weight placed on brands in healthcare. And I don't see that in the US so much. I don't think you care necessarily about the brand of the hospital that you're going to, but in India that matters a lot more. And so these are some of the nuances I had to pick up on as I came and learned, and I think still a lot more to learn. Like we said, India is so vast, and every state is so unique and so different from a socioeconomic standpoint. We haven't even expanded to East India at all, so we haven't touched Kolkata. There's a lot of learning left for us at Loop, and I'm pretty excited about that the next few years.
Yeah, that brand point is fascinating. Could you tell me then, from an Indian perspective, what does Loop mean, right? If you're saying it's so key that you have a brand there, like what would you say is the significance or meaning of your brand?
Yeah, I think Loop for us just meant keeping everyone on the same page, right? Keeping everyone in the loop. And what we mean by everyone is the patient, the health insurance company, the care providers, and then doing it all under one roof. And so I think connectedness is really our focus, because so much of the healthcare system in India is disjointed. And you can imagine most folks in India don't even have an electronic medical record. They've never had that. They have no store of data of their health history, their family's health history. And so every time they go to a new specialist or a doctor, they have to convey all this information about their family health in a few minutes. And because the volumes are so high, the average doctor consult in India for a GP is 6 minutes long. So you don't have much time to get someone on the same page. And so we I think when we started Loop and we actually changed the name to Loop 3 or 4 years ago, we said this really works because it represents what we stand for. It's about building trust and transparency and making sure that everyone's operating and making the best healthcare decisions for the patient, being on the same page as them.
This is going to be an incredibly stupid / silly question, but I'm just kind of curious. Obviously, India has a huge number of English speakers, but in the loop is also it's kind of a metaphor / colloquial phrase. So do people just sort of get that? You kind of know what I mean? There's all sorts of phrases that people use. I was just wondering do Indians who speak English say I'll keep you in the loop? I'm just curious.
They do. We use too many puns actually about Loop in our office, and even customers will pick up on these puns. And so people use Loop. It's in the vernacular. People will say in the loop all the time, or close the loop, or keep me in the loop. So it's quite common. So I think in that sense, it resonates, and people get it very quickly.
Okay, so the big final question I have for you would be, how do you keep your, I don't want to say ambitions in check, but how do you just stay focused? Because we're talking about subcontinents here. We're talking about, East India versus other parts of the country. How do you stay focused and know where to go next, as, to go back to earlier, you navigate the maze?
Yeah, I think we've been very worried about this, actually paranoid for a long time that we would kind of take on too much too soon, which is why we were super committed to sort of one kind of sales motion for a long time, one go-to-market, which is let's go through employers. And the second thing, which is let's focus on a few key geographies. The way we say it is like we'd always rather have, 1 million members in 1 or 2 cities as opposed to having 1 million members in, 15 or 20 cities. And the reason why is because one, I think there's obviously sort of local economies of scale. There's, you develop a brand locally. Word of mouth really matters for the HRs and the people teams we sell to. So there's sort of this natural uplift from sort of building scale locally just on the sales side. But the other thing is delivering really good patient experiences get easier at scale. Right now we have about 200,000 lives insured in Pune, which is that first city we started in. And what that enables us to do is now every time a member checks into one of the major hospitals in Pune and they need to get discharged, we're actually able to physically send a claims runner who can go and negotiate with the TPA to get a discharge done faster for that patient. Just to kind of talk about this example for a moment, the typical discharge time it takes, so when the doctor comes in, maybe the night of your procedure or the morning after your procedure and says, okay, you're good to go, you can get out. The average time it takes to discharge is 6 or 7 hours. And so you may think at 10 a.m. like, hey, my procedure's done, the surgery's done, it's good, I'm stabilized, I'm ready to go home. And then at 10 a.m. the doctor says you can go. You don't leave that hospital till 3 or 4 p.m. that afternoon because there's so much paperwork to do. And guess what? The longer you're there, the more the hospital can bill you, right? And so we realized that there are so many little moments in the healthcare journey that we can make better, and we can invest in higher quality services like the claims advisor who'll show up to the hospital and help you get discharged in 90 minutes and push the hospital to finish your paperwork quickly. We can do that when we have scale in certain cities. And so it's been really important to us to kind of focus on the same GTM and not try to do too many things, to focus on building a base of patients and then think about what more services and products we can build for that group locally. And we know that healthcare is local, right? Like ultimately teleconsults aren't enough. And so if we have everyone concentrated in a few cities, we can build physical healthcare experiences. We can build a health screening product. We can build clinics that you can walk into and get a free checkup in. And so there are a lot of other things we want to build like this. So staying focused is the name of the game.
And I actually do have my real last question here, which is, especially this deep into kind of a bit of the tech slowdown, there's been a lot of discourse of what was a zero interest rate phenomenon, what was kind of like that post COVID outbreak euphoria versus like longer term trends. How have you noticed the energy around investing or building in India either change or remain consistent? Because that's, I say, the biggest difference at a narrative level between us recording the podcast this year and last year.
Yeah, it's totally different, but I will say this. So there's kind of two sides to the story. One, that India as an economy has done really well in the last year. So inflation has been slightly higher, but relatively in check. GDP has grown significantly. And so, there's consumer confidence in the economy, and disposable incomes are being spent at the same rate as they were the last few years. So we haven't really seen in India what we've seen in the US in the last year, which is a bit of a slowdown. And so from that sense, India standalone is doing really well. But I think the one thing we do recognize is that VCs who invest in India, the really high quality investors we've been able to bring on board, like Khosla, General Catalyst, and then Elevation Cap is our Indian investor. They do look at the public market comps for healthcare businesses and insurtech companies, and they look at the US comps as well. So to say there's been no effect would not be true. I think there's definitely some increased focus on profitability, some increased focus on cost cutting, on managing our runway effectively. But on the whole, I think we're in a really good place. And I think we're really excited to have seen 6x growth year on year. I think not that many companies, maybe not that many startups I've heard of outside of AI in the US have seen that kind of growth in the last 12 months. I certainly haven't heard of any stories in healthcare. So I think we're really kind of proud of the growth we've been able to achieve, and we're still really hyper-focused on getting to even larger scale and then kind of turning on the pipes for revenue and kind of keeping a close eye on cost as we do that.
That is an excellent note to end the conversation on. Amrit, this has been really great. Can you just throw out any links or places, maybe your Twitter handle, for folks who want to learn more about your work and continue to follow on afterwards?
Yeah, sure. Follow me on Twitter at AmritXYZ. And I think recently Nikhil Krishnan, who writes a fantastic newsletter called Out of Pocket, did a piece on Loop, and so check that out as well. That's pinned on my Twitter. Otherwise, that's it. Thanks for having me on, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, always a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks for joining us again on The Deep End.
Cool. Thanks, man.